The leaden sky hung low over the ruins of what was once a magnificent alien city. Great towers, now broken like shattered ribs, jutted from the ash-covered ground. Crumbled statues of forgotten heroes and gods lay half-buried in the toxic dust that swirled in the perpetual wind. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of countless lost souls, whispering through empty corridors and collapsed chambers. This was no longer a city. It was a graveyard, a testament to a civilization erased by either war or natural disaster, its history reduced to rubble and radiation. Albert trudged through this wasteland, his weathered boots leaving temporary impressions in the ash before the wind swept them away. His face was partially hidden behind an old air filter mask, the seal compromised in places and patched with whatever materials he'd managed to salvage. The coat he wore had long since faded to a uniform gray, matching the landscape around him. Only his eyes retained any semblance of life, weary, cautious, but ever vigilant, scanning his surroundings for both danger and opportunity. Every day followed the same routine. Wake up in whatever shelter he'd secured for the night, check his meager supplies, then venture out into the graveyard city to scavenge whatever valuables might remain. Today was no different. His backpack already contained several small power cells he'd extracted from collapsed communications center, along with some copper wiring and what appeared to be medical-grade plastic tubing. Not much, but enough to justify the risk of exposure. As Albert carefully made his way across a partially collapsed bridge, his mind drifted as it often did to memories he'd rather forget. Faces flashed before him, his wife, his daughter, his colleagues at the research station. All gone now, victims of the same cataclysm that had turned this once thriving alien metropolis into a necropolis. He alone had survived, protected by a quirk of fate when the emergency protocols malfunctioned, sealing him in a supply closet instead of exposing him to the deadly atmosphere that had killed everyone else in the facility. Survival. That was all that mattered now. That was what he told himself each morning, each night, each time he risked his life, venturing deeper into the ruins. Yet the hollow feeling in his chest whispered the truth he couldn't face. Survival without purpose was just a slower form of death. The bridge groaned beneath him, and Albert quickened his pace, leaping the final gap to safer ground. He consulted his crude map, deciding to explore a previously untouched area to the east. The radiation readings were higher there, but so were the chances of finding untouched resources. Risk and reward, the fundamental equation of his existence now. The new sector appeared to have been some sort of residential area, with smaller structures arranged in concentric circles around what might have been a community center or temple. Albert moved cautiously, testing each surface before putting his full weight on it, listening for the telltale sounds of unstable structures or active technology that might pose a threat. It was then, as he was examining the entrance to one of the larger buildings, that he heard it, a sound so faint he might have imagined it. A whisper, a sigh, something distinctly different from the usual moaning of the wind through the ruins. Albert froze, his hand instinctively moving to the makeshift knife at his belt. Nothing in this graveyard made such sounds unless it was alive, and very few living things here were friendly. He waited, counted his heartbeats, then heard it again. Not a growl or the mechanical whir of a drone, but something almost plaintive. Despite every instinct screaming at him to retreat, Albert found himself moving toward the sound, picking his way through a collapsed wall into what had once been an elegant chamber. The interior was less damaged than the outside suggested, protected from the elements by still intact sections of ceiling. Alien furniture, elegant and strange, lay scattered about, and faded patterns decorated the walls. But Albert's attention was immediately drawn to the far corner, where a pile of fabric shifted slightly, the source of the sound he'd heard. Approaching with caution, knife now drawn, Albert slowly pulled back the fabric and found himself staring into the most unusual eyes he had ever seen. Large, almond-shaped, and a luminescent violet that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, They belonged to what was unmistakably a female member of the alien species that had once inhabited this city. She appeared young, perhaps the equivalent of a human teenager or young adult, though it was difficult to judge with non-human species. Her skin was a pale blue-gray, marbled with slightly darker patterns that might have been natural or cultural markings. Fine, silver-white hair framed a face that, while alien, conveyed unmistakable emotion, fear, pain, and a desperate hope that died as quickly as it had flared when she saw that Albert was not one of her kind. The alien girl tried to move away from him, but only managed to shift her upper body. It was then that Albert noticed the truth. She couldn't move her legs at all. Whether from injury or some congenital condition, she was paralyzed from the waist down. But what struck him most was not her disability, but the evidence of abandonment. No supplies surrounded her, no communication devices, nothing that would suggest someone planned to return for her. She had been left here, alone, to die in this dead city. Albert's first instinct was pragmatic and cold, born from years of survival in a hostile environment. The girl was a liability, a drain on his limited resources. Taking her with him meant slower movement, more food and water consumption, another life to worry about besides his own. The smart choice, the survivor's choice, would be to leave her, perhaps end her suffering quickly if he felt merciful. Yet as he looked at her, something long dormant stirred within him. Her abandonment echoed his own isolation, and in her frightened eyes, he saw reflections of the faces that haunted his dreams, those he couldn't save. Had he survived merely to become as cold as the wasteland around him? Was there nothing left of the man he had once been? "I'm not going to hurt you," Albert said, knowing she probably couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone might convey his meaning. He slowly sheathed his knife and held his empty hands out, palms forward. The girl watched him with undisguised suspicion, her breathing rapid and shallow. With deliberate movements, Albert unslung his pack and removed his water flask. He took a small sip to show it was safe, then offered it to her. After a moment's hesitation, desperation won out over fear, and she accepted it, drinking greedily until he gently pulled it back, knowing that too much too quickly would make her sick. The decision solidified in his mind as he watched her. He couldn't leave her here. Maybe this was suicide, another mouth to feed, another body to protect. But for the first time since the catastrophe, Albert felt something other than the numb routine of survival. He felt purpose. Communicating through gestures, Albert managed to convey that he wanted to take her with him. The girl's resistance had weakened, either from accepting his help or simply from lacking the strength to fight. With great care, he wrapped her in the fabric that had been her only protection and lifted her in his arms. She weighed surprisingly little, whether from the natural physiology of her species or from malnourishment, he couldn't tell. As Albert carried her away from the place of her abandonment, he realized that his path through the graveyard would no longer be a solitary one. For better or worse, their fates were now entwined. Albert's shelter was a far cry from comfortable, but it offered the only safety to be found in the wasteland. Nestled within the partially collapsed hull of what had once been a small transport vessel, the space was cramped but defensible. He had reinforced the walls with scavenged metal sheets and sealed the gaps with a mixture of ash and synthetic resin, creating a space that could keep out the toxic atmosphere and most radiation. Inside, the shelter revealed Albert's resourcefulness. A filtration system cobbled together from salvaged parts hummed quietly, processing air and water. A small power generator, running on energy cells he had scavenged, provided enough electricity for minimal lighting and to power his few precious tools. His meager possessions were arranged with military precision. Medical supplies in one corner, food rations in another, tools and weapons within easy reach. The alien girl observed everything with wary eyes as Albert carefully set her down on his sleeping pallet, the only soft surface in the shelter. He immediately set to work, gathering his limited medical supplies and assessing her condition more thoroughly than had been possible in the ruins. Her injuries went beyond her paralysis. Dehydration had left her skin dull and papery, and several untreated cuts showed signs of infection. glowing faintly with a bioluminescent blue around the edges. Most concerning was her temperature. Even accounting for potential physiological differences, she seemed dangerously cold to the touch. Albert worked methodically, cleaning her wounds with antiseptic, applying the few remaining medicated bandages he had, and wrapping her in his spare thermal blanket. Throughout his ministrations, she remained silent but watchful, flinching occasionally when he touched particularly painful areas. Communication was impossible beyond the most basic gestures, yet he found himself speaking anyway, his voice rough from disuse, explaining what he was doing in a gentle monotone. "This might sting," he murmured as he cleaned a particularly nasty cut on her arm. "But it needs to be done. Infection out. Here, it's a death sentence." Whether she understood his words or merely his tone, she seemed to relax slightly, holding still despite the obvious pain. After treating her injuries, Albert prepared a thin broth from his rations. He helped her sit up against the wall and offered the cup, watching carefully as she sniffed it suspiciously before taking a tentative sip. Her eyes widened slightly, perhaps at the unfamiliar taste or simply from the relief of nourishment, and she quickly drained the cup. That night, Albert slept on the floor beside his pallet, one hand on his knife, listening to the alien girl's breathing in the darkness. He had survived this long by trusting no one, by putting his safety above all else. Now he had invited an unknown entity into his sanctuary, shared his supplies, exposed himself to whatever diseases or parasites she might carry. Part of him questioned his sanity, yet another part, a part he had thought long dead, felt a strange sense of peace. Morning brought the first real crisis of their arrangement. The girl awoke disoriented and panicked, clearly terrified to find herself in a strange place with a strange being. She tried to retreat from Albert, her upper body strength surprising as she pushed herself to the far corner of the shelter, eyes wild with fear. When he approached, she grabbed a nearby tool, a wrench, and brandished it defensively. Albert stepped back, hands raised. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." He gestured to her bandaged wounds, to the food and water he had prepared, trying to remind her of his help. For long minutes, they remained at an impasse, fear and mistrust radiating from her in almost palpable waves. Finally, Albert simply turned his back on her and busied himself with his morning routine, checking the filtration system, organizing his scavenged materials, preparing a simple meal. His apparent disinterest seemed to confuse her, and gradually, her grip on the wrench loosened. When he offered food again, she hesitated but eventually accepted it, hunger overcoming fear. As she ate, Albert attempted to introduce himself, pointing to his chest and stating clearly, "Albert." After repeating this several times, he pointed to her questioningly. She stared at him for a long moment, then slowly pointed to herself and made a sound unlike anything Albert had heard before, a lilting, musical syllable that his human vocal cords could never reproduce perfectly. But he tried nonetheless, mangling the pronunciation terribly. This unexpected attempt seemed to surprise her, and for the first time, her expression softened, almost into what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'll call you Lyrie," Albert decided, giving her a name from the constellation that had always been his favorite in Earth's night sky. "It means music where I come from. Seems fitting." The newly named Lyrie watched him curiously, perhaps recognizing that he had bestowed something significant upon her. The tension in the shelter eased, if only slightly. Their tentative truce was tested that same afternoon when the shelter's power system suddenly failed, plunging them into darkness and stopping the vital air filtration. Lyrie made a sound of alarm as Albert rushed to the generator, quickly diagnosing the problem. A failed connection, easily repaired but requiring his full concentration. As he worked, the air in the shelter grew steadily more stale, and he could hear Lyrie's breathing becoming labored. Fear gripped him, not for himself, but for her. Her physiology might be more sensitive to the changing atmosphere, and he had no way of knowing how long she could survive without properly filtered air. With desperate speed, Albert completed the repair, his hands steady despite his racing heart. The generator hummed back to life, the lights flickered on, and the blessed sound of the filtration system resumed. He turned to find Lyrie watching him intently, her expression unreadable but her posture less defensive than before. She had observed his protection of their shared environment, his concern for their survival. That night, as he prepared their evening meal, Albert noticed Lyrie attempting to drag herself closer to the warmth of the generator. Without thinking, he moved to help her, and for the first time, she accepted his assistance without resistance, allowing him to lift her to a more comfortable position. It was a small gesture, but it represented a significant shift in their dynamic, the first fragile thread of trust woven between them. Over the following days, a routine developed. Albert continued his scavenging missions, but kept them shorter, unwilling to leave Lyrie alone for too long. She seemed to grow stronger with regular meals and rest, and though communication remained rudimentary, they began to develop a primitive sign language of their own, supplemented by drawings in the dust on the shelter floor. Through these limited means, Albert began to piece together fragments of Lyrie's story. She was indeed young by her species' standards, orphaned in the cataclysm that had destroyed the city. The family that had taken her in afterward, distant relatives, he gathered, had seen her paralysis as a burden, especially in the harsh post-disaster world where resources were scarce and mobility essential for survival. Their sign for family was always accompanied by Lyrie's expression of pain and betrayal. Albert understood without needing details. They had brought her to this abandoned sector and left her to die, unable or unwilling to continue supporting someone they saw as useless in their struggle to survive. The cruelty of it ignited a rage in Albert that he had not felt in years. How could any species, any beings intelligent enough to build the wonders he had seen in the ruins, be capable of such callousness toward their own? But then, hadn't humanity committed similar atrocities throughout its history? Hadn't he himself, before the catastrophe, walked past suffering with averted eyes, telling himself it wasn't his problem? One evening, as they sat sharing a meal improved by edible fungi Albert had discovered growing in a protected recess of the ruins, Lyrie looked at him with unexpected intensity and made a series of gestures, pointing to him, then to herself, then making a sweeping motion toward the outside world before returning her hand to her heart. "Why?" she seemed to be asking. "Why did you save me?" The question struck Albert to his core. Why indeed? He had no logical answer, no explanation that made sense in the ruthless calculus of survival. He thought of his wife and daughter, of how he had failed to save them. Perhaps this was atonement, or perhaps simply the last remnant of his humanity refusing to die. "Because we're both still here," he finally answered, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping she might understand the feeling behind them. Because being alive has to mean more than just not dying. Whether she comprehended his meaning or not, something in his response seemed to satisfy her. That night, she shared with him a deeper piece of her past, laboriously drawing in the dust what appeared to be a medical device, a neural interface of some kind that, as Albert eventually understood, had once helped her overcome her paralysis before it was damaged in the cataclysm. The revelation sparked a dangerous hope in Albert's mind. If such technology had existed, perhaps it could be found, salvaged, repaired. Perhaps he could give Lyrie back not just survival, but a future with dignity and independence. It was a fool's errand, a suicide mission. And yet, for the first time since he had found her, Albert went to sleep with something resembling a plan. The following morning, Albert examined Lyrie's condition more closely. Her overall health had improved with proper nutrition and rest, but it was clear that her quality of life remained severely compromised. The paralysis affected not only her mobility, but also caused periodic pain that left her gasping and trembling. During these episodes, all Albert could do was hold her hand and wait for the spasms to pass, feeling utterly helpless. After one particularly bad attack, Albert made his decision. Using their developing sign language, he explained as best he could that he knew of a place that might contain medical technology similar to what she had drawn, a research facility on the far side of the ruins that he had glimpsed during his explorations, but never entered due to the high radiation readings surrounding it. Lyri's reaction was immediate and intense. She grasped his arm with surprising strength, her luminescent eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. She gestured urgently, her movements conveying both desire for what he proposed and fear of what it would mean. Him leaving her alone, risking his life in one of the most dangerous areas of the graveyard city. "I have to try," Albert told her simply. "You can't live like this forever, and neither can I." The preparation took 2 full days. Albert methodically checked and repaired his protective gear, modified his backpack to carry any salvageable technology, and plotted the safest route to the facility based on his radiation maps. He also reinforced the shelter's defenses, creating multiple backup systems for the air filtration and power supply to ensure Lyri would remain safe during his absence. Most difficult was preparing Lyri herself. Albert taught her how to operate the essential systems, how to secure the entrance if anything threatened, how to ration the supplies he would leave behind. She learned quickly, her intelligence evident despite the language barrier, but her anxiety grew visibly as the moment of his departure approached. On the morning he was to leave, Albert found Lyri attempting to fasten something around his wrist. It was a small band woven from threads pulled from her original clothing, decorated with tiny, luminescent beads that must have held cultural significance. The gesture stopped him cold. It was the first gift he had received since the world ended, perhaps the last he would ever receive. "I'll come back," he promised, holding her gaze steadily. "I won't abandon you." Lyri's response was to press her forehead briefly against his in what he took to be a blessing or a prayer. Then she pushed him gently toward the door, her expression resolute despite the fear evident in her eyes. With a final backward glance, Albert sealed the shelter behind him and set off into the toxic wasteland, the weight of his promise heavier than any pack he had carried before. The journey began in familiar territory, through the sectors Albert had scavenged countless times. He moved swiftly, conserving energy and oxygen, his mind focused solely on the path ahead. By midday, he had reached the boundaries of his known territory, where the ruins grew denser and more chaotic. Buildings toppled against one another like fallen dominoes. The radiation levels climbed steadily as he progressed, his crude detector clicking with increasing frequency. Albert adjusted his route, seeking shelter where possible, avoiding the hot spots that glowed an ominous blue-green in his specialized goggles. Progress slowed to a crawl as he picked his way through debris fields and unstable structures. Night brought new hazards. Without sunlight, the temperature plummeted, and strange bioluminescent fungi cast eerie light across the landscape. Worse were the sounds, scratchings and slitherings that suggested he was not alone in the ruins. Whether mutated wildlife or automated defense systems still functioning on depleted power, Albert knew better than to investigate. He found shelter in the hollow shell of what had once been a transport vehicle, sealed himself inside, and passed a restless night, hand on his weapon. Dawn revealed a changed landscape. The ruins here bore different architectural features, more angular, utilitarian, lacking the elegant curves of the residential areas. This had been an industrial or research sector, which aligned with Albert's destination. But it also meant new dangers, chemical residues, unstable experimental materials, perhaps even weaponry. Midway through the second day, disaster struck. The ground beneath Albert's feet, weakened by time and corrosive elements, suddenly gave way. He plummeted into darkness, landing hard on a metal surface 15 feet below. Pain lanced through his leg, not broken, but badly sprained. Worse, his pack had been punctured in the fall, tearing open his water container and damaging his air filter. For long minutes, Albert lay in the darkness, fighting panic. Without water and with diminished air filtration, his survival window had just shrunk dramatically. He thought of Lyri waiting in the shelter, counting the days until his return, and forced himself to his feet despite the pain. Using his emergency light, Albert discovered he had fallen into an underground transit system, tunnels that might provide a safer, if more disorienting, route to his destination. It was a gamble, but with his injured leg and damaged equipment, the surface was now even more dangerous. The tunnels were a maze, some collapsed, others eerily intact. Alien script marked junctions and doorways, incomprehensible to Albert despite his years among the ruins. He made his best guesses, marking his path with chalk to avoid going in circles, advancing steadily despite growing thirst and the increasingly labored breathing caused by his damaged filter. On the third day, or what he estimated to be the third day in the timeless underground, Albert encountered the first other survivor he had seen in years. A figure huddled in a side chamber, surrounded by scavenged technology and illuminated by a sickly green light. Not human, one of Lyrie's species, but older, male, his skin mottled with radiation burns and his eyes filmy with cataracts. The alien's reaction was immediate and hostile. He brandished a weapon, a fusion cutter, lethal at close range, and barked what were clearly warnings in his native tongue. Albert raised his hand slowly, then carefully reached for his pack, producing a power cell as a peace offering. The standoff lasted a full minute before the alien lowered his weapon slightly, curiosity overcoming caution. Albert seized the opportunity to communicate through crude drawings on the dusty floor, sketching Lyrie, her condition, and his destination. The alien's reaction to the drawing of Lyrie was disturbing. Disgust, dismissal, a gesture that clearly indicated worthless or better off dead. Cultural attitudes toward disability, it seemed, transcended species. Yet when Albert indicated the medical facility, the alien's demeanor changed. He made a series of gestures suggesting great danger. Then, surprisingly, offered Albert a crude map drawn in the dust, showing a safer approach to the facility. Whether from a spark of compassion or simply pragmatic cooperation between survivors, the alien had chosen to help. They parted without further communication, two solitary beings briefly connected by circumstance before returning to their individual struggles for survival. The alien's map proved accurate. By the end of what Albert estimated to be the fourth day, he emerged from the tunnels within sight of his destination. A sprawling complex partially buried under collapsed debris, but with its central dome still intact. The architecture identified it clearly as a medical or research facility, sleek and purposeful, even in ruin. But reaching it would not be simple. Between Albert and the facility lay an open space, once a plaza or landing pad, now patrolled by maintenance drones that had survived the catastrophe. Their programming corrupt after years without oversight, they now attacked any moving object, mistaking all for intruders or threats. Albert observed their patrol patterns for hours, conserving his dwindling oxygen as he calculated his approach. His leg throbbed, his throat burned with thirst, and his vision occasionally blurred, signs of radiation sickness beginning to take hold despite his protective gear. There would be no second attempt. It was now or never. When a most distant drone moved to the far edge of its patrol route, Albert made his move, sprinting across the open space as fast as his injured leg would allow. The nearest drone detected him almost immediately, its sensors whirring as it pivoted to intercept. Albert threw his remaining power cell in the opposite direction. The burst of energy as it cracked open confused the drone's sensors just long enough for him to reach the shelter of the facility's entrance. The massive doors were sealed, but a smaller service entrance had been torn open, likely by previous scavengers. Albert squeezed through the gap, cutting his arm on jagged metal, but barely noticing the pain in his desperation to escape the drones. Inside, emergency lighting still functioned on minimal power, casting blood-red shadows across what had once been a reception area. Signs in alien script adorned the walls, and what might have been a directory stood in the center of the room. Useless to Albert, who could only guess at which section might contain the neural technology Lyrie had described. Logic suggested the most advanced medical technology would be in the most secure areas. Following this reasoning, Albert headed for the most intact section of the facility, where security barriers and reinforced doors suggested valuable contents within. The central medical bay, when he finally breached it, was a revelation. Unlike the rest of the ruins, This room appeared almost pristine, preserved by backup systems and isolation protocols. Examination tables, diagnostic equipment, and various implements Albert couldn't identify filled the space, all designed for the physiology of Lyri's species. But what drew his attention immediately was a sealed cabinet against the far wall, marked with what appeared to be warning symbols. Using his utility tool, Albert forced the lock, revealing rows of devices similar to what Lyri had drawn. Neural interfaces, each about the size of his palm, gleaming with the same luminescent technology he had observed in certain aspects of the ruins. As he reached for one, a security system Albert hadn't noticed suddenly activated. A force field sprang to life, trapping his arm, while an automated voice began repeating what he assumed were warnings in the alien language. Pain shot through his captured limb as the field tightened, threatening to sever it entirely. Desperation fueled his next actions. Grabbing a heavy instrument from a nearby table with his free hand, Albert smashed the control panel governing the security system. Sparks flew, the automated voice stuttered and died, and the force field flickered out, but not before sending a powerful shock through his body that left him convulsing on the floor, darkness closing in around his vision. Albert's last conscious thought was of Lyri waiting in the shelter, counting days that would stretch into eternity if he failed now. Alone in the shelter, Lyri fought her own battles. The first day of Albert's absence passed in anxious but determined activity as she practiced operating the essential systems he had taught her about. She had watched carefully during their time together, learning more than he perhaps realized about how his shelter functioned. The second day brought the first crisis when the heating system began to fail as temperatures outside plummeted. Using the upper body strength she had developed through necessity, Lyri dragged herself to the control panel Albert had modified for her reach. With painstaking precision, she followed the sequence he had shown her, rerouting power from non-essential systems to maintain the critical heat. Her success bolstered her confidence, but sleep remained elusive as she strained to hear any sound that might indicate Albert's return or danger approaching. By the third day, real fear began to set in. Lyri found herself constantly checking the supplies Albert had left, calculating how long they would last, wondering if she should begin rationing more strictly in case his absence stretched longer than planned. The silence of a shelter, once comfortable, now seemed oppressive, highlighting her isolation. To distract herself, Lyri began a project. Using materials Albert had brought back from his scavenging, scraps of alien technology, wiring, and components, she started assembling what looked like a communication device. Her fingers moved with practiced precision. Whatever her physical limitations, her mind and hands remained sharp and skilled. On the fourth day, a new terror. Sounds outside the shelter, scratching and sniffing, something alive investigating their sanctuary. Lyri froze, her breath catching in her throat as she reached for the weapon Albert had left her, a crude but effective spear fashioned from pipe and sharpened metal. For hours, she remained motionless, spear clenched in white-knuckled hands, as the creature outside eventually lost interest and moved on. That night, exhaustion finally overcame her vigilance. Lyri dreamed of her life before. Not the painful memories of abandonment, but earlier times, the sensation of movement through neural assistance, the freedom it had granted her, the person she had been before becoming merely a burden to be discarded. She woke with tears drying on her face and a renewed determination. If Albert did not return, she would find a way to survive. She would not give those who abandoned her the satisfaction of having been right about her worthlessness. But beneath this resolve lay a deeper truth she could barely admit to herself. In the short time they had been together, Albert had become more than just a rescuer. He had become her connection to life itself, to possibilities beyond mere survival. Without him, the shelter would remain just that, a shelter, not a home. Consciousness returned to Albert slowly, pain being the first sensation to penetrate the darkness. Every muscle ached, his nerves still firing randomly from the electrical shock. But he was alive, and his pack, When he finally managed to sit up and check it, contained what he had come for: 3 of the neural interface devices, carefully wrapped in protective cloth. Standing was an ordeal that left him gasping. How long had he been unconscious? Hours at least, perhaps a full day. Lyrie would be frantic with worry if she hadn't already given him up for dead. The thought propelled him forward despite the agony of movement. The return journey was a blur of suffering. Albert's water was gone, his filter barely functioning, and the radiation sickness had progressed, causing waves of nausea and weakness that frequently forced him to stop and rest. But the underground transit system provided a relatively direct route back, and the alien's map, committed to memory, helped him avoid the worst hazards. By the time the familiar sectors came into view, Albert was moving on will alone, his body a vessel of pain, carried forward only by the promise he had made. The woven band Lyrie had given him remained on his wrist, a talisman that he touched repeatedly for courage. The final approach to the shelter nearly broke him. Twice he collapsed, crawling the last few meters before finding the strength to stand again. When at last he reached the hidden entrance, his fingers fumbled with the mechanism, too weak and uncoordinated to operate it properly. Inside, Lyrie heard the faint sounds of struggle. At first, she feared another predator, clutching her spear defensively. But then came a pattern of taps. Albert's signal, weakened but unmistakable. With desperate speed, she dragged herself to the door controls, entering the override sequence that would open the entrance regardless of who was attempting to operate it from outside. The door slid open, and Albert literally fell inside, a gray-faced ghost of the man who had left. Blood crusted on his arm. His leg was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and radiation burns marked his exposed skin. But clutched protectively against his chest was his pack, and the triumph in his eyes told Lyrie everything she needed to know before he lost consciousness once more. The roles reversed. Lyrie now became the caretaker. Using the medical supplies Albert had left, she cleaned his wounds, applied anti-radiation treatments, and managed to get small amounts of water into him during his brief periods of consciousness. Her movements were necessarily limited by her condition, but she worked with single-minded focus, repaying the care he had shown her. On the second day after his return, Albert regained enough strength to properly communicate. His first action was to carefully remove the neural interfaces from his pack, holding them before Lyrie's disbelieving eyes. "I found them," he said simply, watching as emotions cascaded across her alien features. Hope, disbelief, fear, and finally a fragile joy that transformed her. Together, they examined the devices. Lyrie's knowledge of her species' technology proved crucial as she guided Albert through the basic principles of the neural interface. It would not restore full function to her legs. The damage to her spine was too extensive for that, but it would allow a degree of neural control over external devices, including mobility aids. Unfortunately, the interfaces required specialized tools to implant properly, tools Albert had not been able to bring back from the medical facility. But his journey had not been in vain. The interfaces themselves were the critical component. The tools could be improvised with sufficient knowledge and care. Over the following weeks, as Albert recovered and regained his strength, they worked together to modify the neural interface for their limited capabilities. Lyrie directed, drawing detailed diagrams and using their now extensive shared sign language to explain the necessary adjustments. Albert executed the delicate work, his hands growing steadier as his health improved. The first attempt at connection failed spectacularly, causing Lyrie intense pain and triggering a seizure that terrified Albert. He almost abandoned the project entirely, unwilling to cause her such suffering, but Lyrie insisted they continue. Their second attempt was more cautious, with Albert creating a rudimentary control system that allowed for gradual power increases. On the third attempt, something miraculous happened. As the interface activated, Lyrie gasped, not in pain, but in shock. Slowly, with trembling hands, she guided Albert to connect the interface to a simple motorized joint they had salvaged from damaged technology. When the connection was complete, Lyrie closed her eyes in concentration, and the joint moved. The implications were world-changing. With this technology, properly developed and expanded, Lyri could eventually control an exoskeletal support system or mobility device. She would never walk unaided, but she would no longer be confined to dragging herself around by arm strength alone. The success transformed both of them. Albert's purpose was no longer merely survival, but building a future. Lyri's eyes now held something they had lacked before. Hope, not just for continued existence, but for growth and possibility. Together, they began to transform the shelter from a mere survival bunker into something approaching a home. Albert expanded the space, incorporating an adjacent structure and reinforcing the connections. Lyri designed systems that would accommodate her developing capabilities, creating workspaces she could navigate with her gradually improving neural-controlled assistive devices. From a medical facility, Albert made additional expeditions, bringing back more advanced components that allowed them to refine the neural interface. Each trip was calculated, careful. Never again would he risk the desperate measures of his first journey. With Lyri's guidance, he knew precisely what to look for and where to find it. 6 months after finding Lyri abandoned in the ruins, Albert watched her navigate their expanded living space using a rudimentary mobility device they had constructed together. It consisted of a frame that supported her lower body while responding to neural commands through the interface, now properly integrated into her nervous system. The movement was awkward, mechanical, nothing like natural walking, but the independence it provided was immeasurable. "We should celebrate," Albert said one evening, after Lyri had successfully used her device to help prepare their meal, a stew made from cultivated fungi and protein from Albert's increasingly productive traps. She looked at him questioningly, the concept perhaps unfamiliar. Albert cleared a space on their makeshift table and produced a small object wrapped in salvage fabric. "I found this today. Thought you might like it." He unwrapped the package to reveal a small musical instrument, something like a flute, but with unusual configurations of holes and valves. Lyri's eyes widened in recognition. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it, handling it with the reverence of a long-lost treasure. After examining it carefully, she brought it to her lips and blew experimentally. The sound that emerged was haunting, a single, pure note that seemed to transform the stale air of their shelter into something living and vibrant. For the next hour, Albert sat in silence as Lyri reacquainted herself with the instrument. Her playing was hesitant at first, then increasingly confident as muscle memory returned. The melodies she created were alien to Albert's ears, following harmonic progressions unknown to human music, yet undeniably beautiful. Perhaps more so for being the first music either of them had heard in years. When she finally lowered the instrument, tears glistened in her luminescent eyes. Without words, she had shared something profound, a piece of herself, her culture, her past that had nothing to do with survival or disability or abandonment. Just pure expression. "Thank you," Albert said simply, reaching across the table to briefly touch her hand. That night marked a turning point. Their existence, which had been focused entirely on necessity, food, shelter, security, medical needs, expanded to include beauty, expression, memory. They began to share more of themselves with each other, finding ways to communicate about their respective worlds and cultures. Using drawings and their ever-evolving sign language, Lyri taught Albert about her species' history, their advanced civilization, their connection to the stars, their devastating civil war that had led to the cataclysm. In turn, Albert shared stories of Earth, sketching landscapes and creatures Lyri would never see, describing oceans and mountains and forests. Through these exchanges, they discovered surprising similarities between their species, a shared capacity for both great cruelty and profound compassion, for destruction and creation, for abandoning the vulnerable, and for risking everything to save another. As their first year together approached its end, they faced a new challenge. The sector they had inhabited was becoming increasingly unstable. Radiation levels were rising, structures collapsing with greater frequency, and resources growing scarcer. They needed to either relocate or significantly reinforce their current shelter. After careful consideration and mapping of the ruins, they chose to stay. This place, however dangerous, was home now. Together, they undertook the enormous task of creating a truly sustainable living space, one that could last not just months or years, but potentially a lifetime. Albert expanded his scavenging range, bringing back solar collectors and power cells from distant sectors. Lyrie, with her growing mobility and technical knowledge, transformed these components into reliable energy systems. They harvested specialized fungi that absorbed radiation, using them as both food source and natural shielding around their perimeter. Most ambitious was their garden. In a sheltered courtyard adjacent to their main living space, they cleared the toxic soil and replaced it with cultivated substrates. Using seeds Albert discovered in an agricultural storage facility, they began growing alien plants adapted to the post-cataclysm environment, plants that produced oxygen, edible fruits, and fibers for clothing and tools. The garden became Lyrie's domain. Her mobility device, continually improved with Albert's help, allowed her to tend the plants independently. Albert often watched her working there, her face serene in concentration, and marveled at how far they had come from that first desperate encounter in the ruins. "I never thought I'd see growing things again," he told her one day as they harvested their first successful crop, pale blue tubers with a nutty flavor. "Especially not here, in this graveyard." Lyrie responded with a gesture they had developed, touching her heart, then making a circular motion that encompassed their home. It meant, roughly, "Together we create life." That night, as they shared a meal made entirely from their own garden, their hands met across the table and remained linked. No words were necessary, no signs needed to communicate what had grown between them. A connection as strong as it was unexpected, a love born from mutual reliance and respect that had blossomed into something deeper. Their relationship evolved naturally, adapting to their unique circumstances and physical realities. Intimacy came in forms neither had anticipated, in the trust of complete vulnerability, in the shared triumph of creating something sustainable from ruins, in the comfortable silence of two beings who had seen each other at their worst and most desperate and chosen to remain. 2 years after Albert found Lyrie abandoned to die, their home had become a small oasis in the wasteland. From the outside, it remained deliberately unremarkable, just another pile of ruins in a graveyard city. But inside and in their hidden garden, life flourished. They had functional power, clean water, growing food, and technologies that continued to improve Lyrie's mobility and their overall quality of life. They were not without challenges. Albert's radiation exposure during his journey to the medical facility had left lasting damage, manifesting in occasional illnesses and diminished endurance. Lyrie's neural interface required constant maintenance and sometimes caused her pain when overtaxed. Resources, while managed carefully, remained finite, requiring constant innovation. There were dangers, too. Twice they had to defend their home against other scavengers, desperate survivors drawn by rumors of a productive garden in the wasteland. Albert had been forced to fight, something he took no pleasure in, but did without hesitation to protect what they had built. Lyrie had developed defensive systems using salvage technology, creating perimeter alarms and deterrents that kept most threats at bay. Yet despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, their bond only strengthened. They had created something neither had believed possible in the aftermath of catastrophe. Not just survival, but a life with purpose and even joy. One evening, as they sat in their garden watching the toxic but strangely beautiful sunset through their filtered observation dome, Lyrie used her instrument to play a new melody, something she had been composing over many weeks. The piece began with haunting, solitary notes that evoked the desolation of the ruins, then gradually transformed, introducing countermelodies and harmonies that spoke of connection, growth, resilience. As the final notes faded, Albert realized she had created a perfect expression of their journey together, from isolation and despair to the unexpected grace they had found in each other's company. "It's us," he said simply. "Our story. Lyrie nodded, her violet eyes reflecting the dying light. She set aside her instrument and took his hand, guiding it to rest over her heart before placing her own hand over his. It was her most intimate gesture, one that transcended the differences in their biology and spoke to the essence of what they had become to each other. Salvation, purpose, home. Beyond their shelter, the graveyard city stretched into the distance, a monument to destruction and loss. Radiation still poisoned the soil, dangerous creatures and machines still prowled the ruins, and the toxic atmosphere still required filtration to breathe. It was not a world meant for life anymore. But within their small sanctuary, Albert and Lyrie had defied the narrative of mere survival. They had proven that even in a place of death, life could find not just a foothold, but a flourishing. Their existence was a quiet rebellion against despair, a testament to the possibility of beginning again after everything has been lost. As darkness fell, they retreated inside their home, sealing the door against the hostile night. The soft glow of their power systems illuminated the space they had created together, part human, part alien, wholly unique. Outside, the wind moaned through empty corridors and toppled towers, carrying the ash of a dead civilization. But inside, two beings from different worlds shared warmth, purpose, and a future neither could have imagined alone. In an alien graveyard, where a paralyzed girl had once been abandoned to die, two survivors had found not just each other, but a reason to live. Their light, small though it might be against the vast darkness surrounding them, burned steadily. The only true sign of life in a landscape of ruin, a beacon of possibility in a world of endings.